Well, ladies and gentlemen, members of the Royal Logistic Corps, fellow Carmen and guests and speakers, welcome to this lecture, Leading in Challenging Times. Carmen is honoured to be associated with the Royal Logistic Corps and its foundation. We have been affiliated with the Corps since 1993. My personal connection goes back to World War I, as my grandfather was a junior officer with the Royal Army Service Corps, the predecessor to the RLC. As a young boy, I remember asking my grandfather, what was it like in World War I and the Battle of the Somme in 1916 in which he participated? He refused to give me details of the war, but I do recall his advice and observation. The best planned campaigns go wrong, so don't moan, adapt, and get on with it. This inspired my theme for my year as Master of Carmen, onwards and upwards. We are privileged today to have Brigadier Lee Daly, who at very short notice has had to stand in for General Angus Fay, who has been called away on important duties. Again, we have an example of the best laid plans, etc. So Lee is required to get on with it. I'm sure the Duke of Edinburgh would have had the same feeling and attitude. Brigadier Lee Daly is a distinguished and successful army officer. He has served overseas in Bosnia, Kosovo, Sierra Leone, and Afghanistan, and was Theatre Logistics Group Commander on Operation Herrick 20, where the unit closed and transferred Camp Bastion to the host nation, a massive undertaking. He is now part of Defence Support in the UK Strategic Command and is head of logistics transformation. He is professionally well qualified and a past graduate of Defence Logistics Staff Course. Lee is chairman of the UK Armed Forces Nordic Scheme. Please welcome Brigadier Lee Daly in the traditional way.
Thank you, Peter, and it's delightful to be here on behalf of General Angus, who of course sends his apologies, but as you say, has sent a deputy in his place, a good organisation, resilience at the start. So I've got a few minutes just to say a few words on behalf of General Angus, and before we get into the real quality of today, the rich menu of speakers we've got from academia, industry, and the Ministry of Defence. And I hope that whilst you listen to the content of today, you also prepare some questions, the really valuable questions and answer session we've got at the end. This is really a session for your benefit, and it's really up to you to grab the opportunity to engage with the quality presenters available this afternoon. But before we get to those quality presenters, you've got to listen to me for a couple of slides. So if I can have the first slide, please, Russ. I've only got 2 slides you'll be pleased to hear, but I'm going to talk about organisational and then individual resilience and what it means to me and to the Royal Logistic Corps. So really, resilience is what the RLC does for both the Army and the wider Ministry of Defence. We provide support, strength, agility, endurance and reach to UK military forces. We provide both specialist and logistic capability from niche skills such as explosive ordnance disposal, air dispatch, and divers to massive logistic effect through transport and supply. And we operate as a corps in the UK base in support of the government, and we've seen that very recently with the COVID response and on operations across the globe. Next slide, please. And individually, let's have a little look about what the Corps is trying to do to provide resilience to its people. This slide is a rather shameless plug for the new Royal Logistic Corps strategy, which aims to focus the Corps' outputs over the next 5 years into 4 key strands. It has 4 interconnected but symbiotic elements that deliver organisational resilience to the Corps, but importantly, individual resilience to our serving and former members. And how do we do that? So from a Corps perspective, professionalising our Corps through our people with talent management, encouraging innovation at all levels, and increasing the understanding and pride of the RLC achievements. into driving technology, data decision making, access to chartered institutes and academia, and providing our core members with the skills and capabilities needed by defence for the future. We're encouraging and informing external integration through our defence support and wider logistic enterprise, including other government departments, our sister services, the RLC Foundation, and our industry partners. And finally, enabled through effective and rapid communication to all our internal and external stakeholders, retain the narrative of what we do and why. And for the individual personnel within the Corps, the strategy objectives are aimed at delivering tangible outputs that will enable, encourage, and inform members of the RLC community, that's regular and reserve, serving and veteran, so that they are more employable as a soldier and as a civilian, better trained in the technological skills they'll need, better motivated and positive, and aware of opportunities within defence and in their second careers, and finally, more able to respond quickly to any challenge, recover quickly, and regain the initiative, ready for the next battle, which is truly what resilience means to me. So this afternoon's session, you're going to get a really, hopefully, rich view across many different perspectives from a real assortment of quality presenters. And it's my real pleasure to introduce your first one today, Professor Richard Walding. I've heard the Professor brief on a number of international events, and it has always been a real treat. He is a full professor in supply chain strategy at Cranfield School of Management and is recognised globally for his thought leadership in logistics and supply chain management. Richard is described by the BBC as one of the world's leading experts in logistics and supply chain management. And I think importantly for us, he's passionate about taking and creating academic knowledge that creates action in business, tangible outputs, not just theory. Richard was a recent chairman of the Chartered Institute of Logistics and Transport, the professional body representing all those involved with the movements of goods and people and their associated supply chains. And he holds a number of senior non-executive directorships. It's a real pleasure for me to introduce Professor Richard, and sir, over to you.
Thank you very much indeed, Lee. Well, it's a real privilege to be presenting to you today. And basically what I'm going to be talking about is supply chain leadership, and also really some of the resilience issues which come out of that. But actually what I want to do is reflect on leadership, because one of the things that we've been working on at Cranfield for a number of years is projects around, if you like, called leading next generation supply chains. What we've actually found is that a lot of the things that, you know, we used to do, the stuff, if you like, we were teaching in business schools only a number of years ago, are now becoming, if you like, less appropriate to the world that we're actually operating in now. So what I want to really do is to take you through a bit of a journey on some of the ways in which we're having to think differently about how we're leading within supply chain projects, and also the importance of this when it comes to actually creating resilience. So basically, we have, let me just, quick introduction. Thank you very much indeed for that introduction. Just to highlight my background, I'm an engineer by background. I'm a logistician, procurement. I'm also got this wonderful title of National Teaching Fellow. So I actually help teachers in higher education teach at not just my university, but universities around the world. There's about 50 of us each year who actually get this honor. Cranfield, well, it's postgraduate, very important to realize that. We don't have undergraduate students currently, and it's all about knowledge into action. And yes, former chairman of the Chartered Institute of Logistics and Transport. Also, if you want to connect to me on LinkedIn, I'm going to be putting some stuff up on LinkedIn in the next day or so. I've got a LinkedIn newsletter there, but if you follow me on LinkedIn, you can actually get that information on there. It's quite a good source, so I use that to share various other things which are going on, and I'm sort of recognized as unbelievably one of the key influencers now on LinkedIn with the sort of the stuff and comment which is actually being shared out there. Don't know how that happened, but anyway. Now, Where does Cranfield operate? Very importantly, we operate globally with all sorts of different businesses. So I'm working across a whole raft of organizations around these particular issues on leading supply chains and also thinking about resilience within their supply chain. So that's a little bit about the background here. So what am I going to be talking about? Well, first of all, I just want to highlight some of the foundations of Supply Chain 4.0 and some of the opportunities which are there. This is really important because we've just had in the last 12 months, a burning platform has been created for new technologies coming in. That requires us to lead within that environment. We've got modern leadership, which is taking place, and I'll define what I mean by that in a VUCA world. And leadership for next generation supply chains, and then leadership for supply chain resilience. So the first really important thing to actually think through is that the world is pretty unstable. This is some work which was done by some of my colleagues some time ago. Really what this chart was actually looking at was various things like exchange rates. It was looking at things like the cost of metals, precious metals. It was looking at the cost of shipping, for example, all sorts of different things. And we bundled all this together and came up with the volatility index. And in a summary, between 1970 and then 2015, volatility was increasing. So volatility, uncertainty, complexity, ambiguity, all these things were just increasing and rapidly increasing. So this actually sets a bit of a scene, because at the end of the day, what we were starting to find was that, a lot of the stuff you learn on an MBA was stuff that was really maybe, from the 1970s, maybe the 1980s. But the question is now, is that appropriate for the 20s we're moving into and beyond? And what we have is, if you like, these foundations of Supply Chain 4.0. Cybersecurity, number one. I've moved this on my little table to number one. This is absolutely critical. Supply chains now, in terms of resilience, are being shut down because of cyber attacks. Okay, we've had enough with physical viruses, the pandemic, but hey, keep an eye open for those virtual viruses as well. So cybersecurity, number one. Systems integration, big data analytics, simulation, virtualization, the Internet of Things, the cloud, autonomous systems, augmented reality, additive manufacturing. Within the supply chain, all these elements are being combined. So yes, we've got lots of technology moving forward on each individual element, but actually what's happening is we might find in a warehouse, we've got additive manufacturing, 3D printing, rather than storing physical items. We are storing them virtually, and then we're making them when we need them. Augmented reality could be vision picking, so using more or less Google glasses to identify things within that warehouse environment. Autonomous systems, we can have things following us around with us in that warehousing environment. We've got the Internet of Things, and then all this is going into sort of data analytics, and it's in the cloud. So even if you're looking at things like blockchain, all blockchain is really doing, you could argue, is taking elements of these building blocks and combining them. So these are the big building blocks that we're seeing. And really the key thing that has happened recently is that the planets are aligning. They have aligned, that you could argue, at this point in time. Things have really started to move forward with regard to this. Now, we're also in a world where effectively what we have is, if you like, a bimodal supply chain. Mode one is all about focusing on predictability. This is, if you like, the lean side of things. This used to work really well in the 1980s, lean, just in time, all those things. It was about efficiency, cost reduction, managing predictable swings and inventory fluctuations, and focusing on risk mitigation and prevention. We also have mode two, and mode two is focused on exploration. It's all about agility, flexibility. It's about speed. It's dynamic, it's iterative, it's strategies for solving the unexpected or adapting to new technologies. So this is a very different sort of mode of operation. And you could argue that, in the old normal, the back end of 2019 and the first month or so of 2020, 80% of what we did was probably in mode one. And then we had about 20%, which was operating in mode two. And what we've seen in the last 12 months, a massive switch. And also this is causing absolute, people trying to forecast, well, all your data streams now, you haven't got a data stream for what's been going on in the last 12 months. So all your forecasting is wrong. Okay, we've got artificial intelligence, but you still have to actually allow those systems to learn, and they haven't got, if you like, the capability to learn some of the new things that are happening. So all of a sudden we've had a switch that, from 80-20 from mode 1 to 2 to the other way around. You could say 80% of what we're doing now is having to operate in mode 2, but we have to manage these simultaneously as we move forward. So what is leadership? And this is really important to consider. So leadership is people aiming to create direction, alignment, and commitment. This is what we're actually talking about here, is how do we actually create an environment where we can create direction, alignment, and commitment within that environment. So shared or collaborative leadership, and we'll talk about this in a minute, is multiple people on the team providing leadership. So it's not like this great big leader, sort of leading. It's a very different environment that we're having to actually sort of think through and move through. Now, this is just really thinking about a couple of problems. So I'll explain what there is here. So if you're thinking about leadership, what we have is degrees to which outcomes can be specified, and you've got known and you've got unknown. And you've also got the degree to which the process for getting those outcomes can be specified, so getting to that location. So here's just a crazy example from my colleague Kim James. Fast food, right? Fast food, you know the outcome, right? And you know the process you're going through. So this is pretty straightforward. Whether it's a KFC or a McDonald's, if I worked in one, I could work into another. Similarly with restaurants, gourmet food, we're not quite sure of the outcome, but we know those fundamental processes that we actually need to go through to get to that point, right? So we sort of know that, you could argue maybe with PPE or vaccines, there are similar types of building blocks that we want to basically apply to achieve a particular objective. However, we've got things like healthy school food. Now that basically starts us on a bit of a journey where we have, it's a bit unknown as to how we're going to get people to eat like healthy food. It's starting to bring in all sorts of different things. But then the biggest challenge is healthy habits. So here's somebody who had leftover Kentucky Fried Chicken for lunch. Not a great healthy habit, okay? And he probably went and drank far too much last weekend and so on and so forth. But here what we're trying to do is we're having to change the way that we're having to lead within these environments. And effectively what this creates is a situation where we end up with really two areas here: traditional, technical, individual, leader focus. So if you think about our fast food restaurant or our gourmet restaurant, you can have somebody basically, the chef in charge telling them what to do. That isn't going to work within your school dinners type project or getting healthy habits. It's going to require all sorts of different people to be involved in this to actually get this work. And this is really part of the challenge we're working in. Why? Because a lot of the supply chain projects and supply chain resilience, it's no longer on, if you like, the left-hand side of this chart. We're now moving into the right-hand side of the chart, and that starts to present some problems. So when we're trying to resolve these particular areas, if you think about it, on that left-hand side, it's linear. Yes, it might be complicated. There's no doubt that this is incredibly complicated, okay? But there is processes we can work within. You can apply successful solutions from your learnings from the past. On the other side, however, the future is not an extrapolation of the past, differing starting points, differing trajectories. It's multi-dimensional, it's messy, it's iterative. So basically one of the key things that all the research is starting to show is that the single most common source of leadership failure we've been able to identify is that people, especially those in positions of authority, so we all need to be very careful here, treat adaptive challenges like technical challenges. And that creates some significant issues for us as we're moving forward, because different sort of styles, completely different styles are required within this. So, I mean, here's something from a Harvard Business Review article. A little bit detailed, but you can see what it's focusing on is command and control, consensus, and collaborative leadership. And it really talks about, you know, the organizational structures, who has the relevant information, for example, who has authority to make the final decision, what is the basis for accountability and control, and where does it work best? Now, let's just look in detail at those two areas. So let's think about command and control. You know, it's hierarchical. That's the organizational structure. If we're looking at consensus, it might be matrix and small group. Collaborative, it's dispersed cross-organizational networking. So if I go to command and control, where does it work best? It works well within a defined hierarchy, works poorly for complex organizations and when innovation is important. But if I go and look at consensus, it works in small teams, works poorly when speed is important. And then when we move over to collaborative, works well for diverse groups and cross-unit, cross-company work, and when innovation and creativity is really important and critical. So the point is from a supply chain perspective, we have to start choosing the different types of leadership style to be demonstrated in those areas. One project we were working with was the supply chain director of Fitbit. And this is just a chart to show all the different people who had to be involved in launching a Fitbit product, okay? And the point was that this was rapid development. They were using collaborative leadership approaches to really make this work and move forward. So this becomes quite important within the commercial environment. Now, one of the other things that we've been having to think about is leadership for next generation. A number of key elements need to be there. You have goal and performance focus, external collaboration, customer and market focus, change focus and management, internal collaboration, and people and team management. We did a load of research around this, and the traffic lighting shows the stuff that people did really well and also the people who didn't do so well in it. So if we're looking at everybody, the big challenge areas were people and team management, collaboration. You know, it doesn't matter whether it was internal or external, it was how you manage those relationships, and also the change management side of things. These were some of the key areas that really gave people some big challenges as they were moving forward. So let's just have a think then about the whole issue of what we mean by supply chain resilience. It's the adaptive capability of the supply chain to prepare for unexpected events, respond to disruptions, and recover from them by maintaining continuity of operations at the desired level. That's how we academically define this. The adaptive capability of the supply chain to prepare for unexpected events, respond to disruptions, and recover from them. Okay, so that's really the key essence of what we're trying to deal with. And what we're starting to find is in the new normal, to create resilient supply chains, we're having to think very differently. So, you know, a couple of key things: procure for resilience rather than for cost. The debate around onshoring, nearshoring, multi-shoring, thinking about the supply chain networks we have in place, thinking about, you know, the changes in practices we need within our supply chains, even from the perspective of social distancing. We're having to innovate, taking ideas which are new to myself and creating economic, social, or environmental value. But critically, it's collaboration as well. That is really important to be able to make this work. And in a way, I summarize all of this in this temple of supply chain resilience. I was actually doing another presentation yesterday to the military around this particular issue. But First of all, get clarity in your supply chain strategy. Really important. Think about the design of the product or the service that you actually have. You've got to have collaboration, agility, but a supply chain risk management culture. Culture is what people do in the absence of instruction when they're under a bit of pressure. So how does the supply chain respond when it's under a bit of pressure? Does everyone just fall into their silos, or do they start thinking process? And, you know, we often talk about the terminology of becoming more T-shaped. But also think through supply chain transparency is absolutely critical to make this work, and continuous monitoring and intelligence. So one of the things we've seen through supply chain over the last 12 months is new products coming to market. So we've seen things like, you know, DHL's Resilience 360 coming to its own. And, you know, they've got a new analytics platform that they're partnering with on that. We've got Maersk looking at the NeoNav concept. Interestingly enough, I was on a, you know, an event with Maersk, for Maersk customers, and we had Nestle and Maersk there. Suez Canal gets blocked, all right? How long did it take you all to find out precisely what was on the container vessels and which container vessels were going to be disrupted and therefore be able to plan for it? Well, it turns out that a pilot was being run with Nestle at the time using some of the new technologies which are available. Within 15 minutes, they knew every item on every boat that was being disrupted, and for that market, they were able to plan. Why? Because they got continuous monitoring and intelligence and supply chain transparency in place to make all this work. So that, you will be pleased to hear, is all I'm going to say to set the scene. Loads of other information. Find me on LinkedIn. There's also online courses that you can download for free. There's stuff on YouTube, so do go there. But really, I think the key thing to just finish on is this graphic here. Think through resilience. Make sure you've got these elements in place. And I mentioned that I'm literally just writing this up for a LinkedIn newsletter. So it's going on to LinkedIn probably tomorrow morning now. But that'll explain a bit more about this. But in terms of leadership, you've got to choose the right approach. And also, leadership really influences the resilience of this whole temple when you start to look at it. So thanks very much. And I'm going to hand over now to Hugh.
I'm just waiting to be unmuted. Sound check?
Yep, good.
Great. Thanks, guys. Well, Richard, thank you. Insightful as ever. I've just got this vision of you popping up at the McDonald's counter now next time I go and get a cheeseburger, which will stay with me for a while. I remember those 80s and 90s references when Kanban was something new. And it's interesting to just try and keep up with the development of this academic thought leadership. And it's always fascinating to listen. So thank you so much. Richard, when we do conferences like these, we never get together and we never really get a chance to discuss the theme. But it's fascinating listening to the opening speech and then Lee and then Richard to see that we've just picked some similar threads, which is quite reassuring. So we'll see how we get on. Ross, can you start the video for me, please? Thank you, Russ. If you could stay with the first slide. Thank you. Well, first of all, delighted to be here again. Last time we were in actually face-to-face in a social distancing safe area with a virtual audience present down in Tidworth in October, where we talked about the insights and learnings from COVID. That is the normal for all of us now. So we're going to touch today on a little bit about leadership in challenging times, and brilliant and rewarding to listen to Richard's presentation. I'm going to tell a bit more of a personal story around Leidos. Hopefully the introduction was of interest to you. Clearly a US bias, but it tells you and gives you some context around Leidos and their organizations across the world and some of the areas in which we operate. But absolutely it points to some of the challenging times that we're going to touch on today. My name's Hugh Jenkins. I'm the Chief Operating Officer and currently Interim MD for the LCST program. And most of you will be familiar with what we do, and I'll bring some of that to life through the course of the presentation. Next slide, please. So I'm going to take you back 18 years to Neville Hall Hospital in Abergavenny. My wife was giving birth to my eldest son, Samuel, and she was in a bit of pain. Now, my wife never argues, never complains about pain. Her threshold is far higher than mine will ever be, but she was in a bit of bother, and I was getting a bit stressed. And I was sticking my head out the birthing suite and looking down the corridor, shouting, "Nurse, nurse," and no one came. And Charlotte was using more gas and more air, and I was getting a bit apprehensive. So finally, I just ran up the corridor to where the nurses were sat having a cup of tea, and said, "Nurse, my wife really needs some help. She's not feeling so good." And she said, of course she's not feeling well. Of course she's hurting. It's called labour, Mr. Jenkins. And if you continue to cause this sort of fuss, I might ask you to leave the building. And I thought about that word, and it stayed with me forever. Labour. Labour is work. Work is hard. Work is hard, right? We would all recognise that. What should work be? Well, the very nature of what we do is difficult. Work should be fun. Work should be fulfilling. But it's hard. But I would argue that I'm 51 years old and I've worked since I left university. But I would argue that this last 12 months has been the hardest labour, the hardest experience that I've ever known. And I'm going to share with you some of the experiences that we've had. Next slide, please. So what have we had to contend with? You'll know most of this. Well, we've all had to contend with COVID. And in previous presentations, I've shared with you in a little bit of detail around what that's meant for Leidos and for the LCST program and dealing with the NHS and the military. Sourcing was a huge problem. China shut down. We chased new suppliers in Europe. We had to move suppliers across Europe. That new sourcing, that on-contracting of new suppliers, and making sure that we were rigorous in our discipline in taking those suppliers on board, but also managing expectations for the military and our customers, our front-end customers, and really communicating effectively what we can and what possibly we can't do during those challenging times. COVID was a real challenge for us, and all of you will have experienced that. You know that we supported the PPE, you know that we supported ventilators, and right now, I know some of my team won't be listening to this, but I know some are, and they're still working on the vaccine distribution right now across the military. But what else? Then we had EU transition. The processes or lack of processes that left us with just meant that people were left with nothing. And Richard talked about, I think he said, without strategy, you rely on culture. And our culture and what we rely on in those times is fundamentally important to whether we succeed or we fail. Some of you in the audience will be familiar with the NATO 302 procedure, which was clearly not fit for purpose post-Brexit. And the customs landscape just wasn't ready. It was conflicted. The commercial and military hybrid ways of working were not compliant with a post-Brexit way of a post-Brexit scenario. But what else? Then Richard talked about earlier, the Suez Canal, 6-day blockage, complete disruption. Air freight prices soared, capacity was shot, demand completely overwhelmed capacity. Slots to book shipping shipping slots were worse than Waitrose at Christmas. You just couldn't get one. And that just meant that operational congestion and backup was causing real operational difficulties right at the sharp end, right down for front end experience for customers. No good. How did we overcome that? Well, our approach was a user-centric and collaborative approach, but we were addressing this at a time when the MOD were also going through a significant change. And I'd just like to touch on that with the next slide, please. Next slide, please, Russ. Thank you. Three things I just want to touch on: changing customer requirements, the military, what are they going through? And part of that was the integrated review, which many of you will be familiar with, and also the defence support strategy. In terms of the LCST programme, we were already embarked just before COVID really struck, and towards the end of 2019. We were working through establishing new performance metrics, which really meant that front-end customers could really understand how what we did for them could be measured to improve performance and really improve that front-end user experience. That was aimed at improving availability and reducing costs. Our whole programme is based on delivering hundreds of millions of pounds of benefits to the MOD. So anything we do to improve performance cannot compromise our ability to deliver reduced costs for the MOD. And that changing environment just brought new agenda items up as a priority, sustainability probably being the top of that, and it's one I've picked here. When you look at, as soon as the military and where we're exposed to the military's involvement in that sustainability agenda, the minute they step onto that treadmill, we've seen that we're way behind. That agenda is moving so fast. Circular economy, social values. I read this morning that Asda are about to introduce second-hand clothes in their stores. Watch out, guys. We're not going to do that just yet. But it's an interesting dynamic, and it's one that's going to introduce itself into our world. In terms of the integrated review, again, within the military itself, some changing priorities. Investment and funding challenges, yes, but also huge opportunity for further transformation, certainly around cyber, certainly around space, and certainly around digital integration. And in terms of the defence support strategy, our ability to adapt to that changing landscape, where we really get under the nails of real-time data to drive responsibility and accountability right down at the front end, is something that we're heavily involved in and really excited about as we move forward. Next slide, please. So when we talk about leadership in challenging times, I just chose two words, and really I could have chosen one, and that would be communication. So communication and data. Data, of course, is a part of communication, but I just want to focus on for the next couple of minutes is the human element of communication and how technology supports effective communication. Next slide, please. So what did COVID do? We all experienced it. Well, first of all, it absolutely drove a coach and horses through our ability to grab hold of someone, look them between the eyes, and explain to them what was important, what we wanted them to do. So face-to-face meetings, 7th of March, I think it was, or sorry, 17th of March, just stopped. We closed down all operations, and we no longer had that ability. Then we all had the ridiculous scenario of going straight into that virtual world. Well, first of all, our IS resilience was tested, and James Langley and the team did a wonderful job within Leidos to ensure that we had that communication ability. We set people up at home very quickly to work effectively. But all that period, you remember it, come on, you're on mute, you're on mute, you're on mute. Well, we still do, we still experience it now. But in those early days, that was all a novelty. And look how far we've come. Who would have thought I'd be stood in the playroom at home in Oxfordshire delivering this presentation? The resilience we've all shown has been fascinating. But so what about not having face-to-face meetings? We all know, or most of you will know, that the content of any communication is actually only worth 7% of the 100% of what you're trying to convey. body language, tone, and eye contact is absolutely critical. So when you move to that virtual world, how do you compensate the lack of what you feel inside your ability to truly communicate to someone? How often have we been in work and someone's come with a problem and you've gone, let me go and see him, let me go and see her, or even I'm going to pick up the phone. But this virtual world has challenged us all, but it's also brought some real learnings and some fascinating, sustainable improvements, I would suggest. What we did around lockdown is we established very quickly some drum beats and some communication channels with our colleagues and with our customers. So from the military point of view, and I've said this before, this is where the Army were absolutely at their best. Their ability to set up forums, set up communication channels, to make decisions quickly, information in, information out, decision made, act, review, correct or celebrate the success and move on to the next challenge. We were completely outnumbered, but it was fantastic to see. It was a privilege to be part of. But also from our own colleagues, we as an organization can't deliver for the military unless our colleagues are absolutely on board with what we're trying to do. What we found interesting was that, of course, colleagues who were no longer walking or commuting to work had more time on their hands. That time actually meant that their expectation around how a leadership team would communicate was heightened. They wanted more from us. Richard's point earlier about the different styles of leadership in different environments and not relying on just the hierarchy was absolutely right. You can't have one person communicating to everybody in an organization at once. And in a virtual world, you could say that that's made slightly easier because everyone can connect in. But actually, we were really reliant on pockets of communication across the organization. What we did really quickly is we set up WebExes such as this through various platforms. But more importantly, we decided on establishing punchy, frequent communication, videos, just giving them real, honest and updated feedback. I remember speaking when we closed down the offices and saying to our colleagues as we closed offices down and said, go home and sign on and sign into the virtual world. We don't know what's going to happen. We have no idea, but this is what we're going to do. And this time next week, we'll tell you what we now know, what new news we know. So building that trust was really important. And of course, in that world, when there is a lack of communication, there is a void, we're really reliant on that trust, on that credit in the bank you've got with your colleagues that know that they're sitting at home, they're waiting, but they're trusting you, that they're going to tell you information. And that's never more palatable now as we return back to work, anticipated in June, how we're going to return back to work, how we're going to do that effectively, COVID safe, but not just return back to work as we were. No one will. No one will just, it would be ridiculous to fall back into that methodology. What we've got to do is learn from what we've experienced in this last year. I think the other thing that we did is we made sure we had a bit of fun, and fun wasn't mandatory, by the way. There's only certain people that particularly like to have fun at work, but I happen to be one of them. But I'm not particularly creative, but I know that in my team, we've got some fantastic creative people. And I was in awe of some of the activities that they invoked with their teams around pub quizzes, virtual pub quizzes, which just replicated, as the Americans would say, that water cooler moment. That opportunity just to chat and talk about things outside of work was still very important to keep that momentum. Next slide, please. Thank you. So if human communication is important, which I've touched on, so of course is data. And data is the heart of LCST, that our whole IS transformation program. This enables improved decision-making, automated communication. So in a time of crisis, and Richard talked about it earlier, actually, when you talk about the 80-20%, we are still on a journey of transformation, of taking that manual activity and transforming it into automated activity. People understanding where to go, where to get data, where to get information, visibility of availability, control of availability. All those things are absolutely critical during that time. Unpicking defenses, complex data architecture is at the heart of what we do. And with a combination of effective human communication, building on the data transformation that we've established within the program was a real recipe for success during the last 12 months. Next slide, please. Thank you, Russ. So to conclude, I've just stolen a slide actually from a customer update that we deliver in our monthly review, and it just gives you a little snapshot of some of the things that we've done recently and over the past few months, and just the different areas where we've been able to demonstrate good leadership, and true resilience in these challenging times. You'll see on there these will mean more to some of the military, some of the army than perhaps other military, but you'll get the gist. We've referenced some operational support, some really key operational theatres. We absolutely reference our benefit delivery, where we continue to deliver those hundreds of millions of pounds worth of benefit for the MOD. We can't take our eye off that ball. We are driving the sustainability agenda, and we're delighted to support General Hutchins in his objectives there. And when we're really excited about what we think we can achieve and how we can bring this environment kicking and screaming into the thought leadership around sustainability. We've got a way to go, but that means we've got a lot to do and a great opportunity. We want to continue our IS transformation. That means still dealing with some legacy systems that hopefully you never hear about. As customers out there, you never hear about them because we do them in the background. Our AS community never become heroes. They just become villains when things go wrong. We all know that. And even things like our modest but unique contribution to the Duke of Edinburgh's funeral. Incredible pride from the team. We have a lot of ex-MOD colleagues in our organisation. Incredible pride, and it was quite humbling to see how people were so proud of our modest support there. So resilience through communication and data exploitation would be my key message, and success through the collaboration. That would be my key message, and I hope you've enjoyed my brief chat today. I'm delighted and a pleasure to hand over to Major General Duncan Capps. Thank you.
Just see if we can bring this up. Okay, good afternoon, and don't be fooled by the slide. I am in fact a logistician, and the neighbourhood has definitely gone downhill since they gave the keys to this place to the loggies. Just by way of background, before I came to Sandhurst, I was running the Army's Regional Command, which looks after local authority support. Prior to that, I was responsible for DISCOM, which someone would be aware of. And prior to that, I was in the Permanent Joint Headquarters as a senior loggie there, and then before that, I was in charge of 104 Logistic Brigade, and I did a turnout in Afghanistan. And what I'd like to cover this afternoon, which is really taking on the theme from Hugh and Richard, and by the way, I've written down, Hugh, that fun is not mandatory, and as the new cadets arrive this Sunday, I shall remind them of that. I'd like to talk about leadership in challenging times. And I would just like to do a shameless plug up front for the Centre for Army Leadership, for which I'm responsible for as Director Leadership. And a lot of the lessons and thoughts that we've drawn out of the support that we've been doing to the National Health Service through the COVID challenge are available as open source on their website. If you go to the QR code or look at the website, along with a whole load of other really helpful open source material, which you may find interesting. So as you'd expect, the British Army's got to be prepared to operate effectively in a crisis and continue to be effective through challenge. We've got to be able to lead through uncertainty. We've got to be able to be resilient under frankly intense and sustained pressure. We've also got to be comfortable, I guess, and confident about operating across the full spectrum of tasks that we're likely to be asked to do. And that could be military aid to civilian authorities, of which most of the support we've been doing through COVID would come under, to our raison d'etre, which is major combat operations, and frankly, everything in between. And whilst the context of these operations is going to differ, the fundamentals of good resilient leadership endure. So what I'd like to do this afternoon in about 30 minutes is discuss some of the framework of what the British Army has found works when leading through challenge, and then bring out a few personal examples from my time in Brigade Command, both in the United Kingdom and in Afghanistan. From a doctrinal basis, the British Army believes that how effectively we lead really underpins everything we do. It sets the culture, the climate, and the lived experience for our people, and it's critical in crisis and sustaining us through challenge. There are two fundamental defining outputs for us. The first is effectiveness for our role, and that's delivering our mission success, whatever that might be. And the second piece is developing us and supporting our people and sustaining our teams. The essence of British Army servant leadership is that it is by example and that it is values-based. We believe that it is that leadership that underpins and enables mission command, and some of you will have heard of this, and this is our philosophy essentially, that empowers subordinates and should allow them maximum freedom of action in executing the plan, the how of what they are doing. And our philosophy is underpinned by our values, our morals, and our ethical foundations, shaped by shared purpose, mutual trust, respect, and empowerment at all levels. And I suppose the bottom line up front, if you remember or listen to nothing else this afternoon, is that we believe if you get those basic building blocks right, then leadership at all levels and across the wider organisation is going to continue to be successful and sustainable through challenge. We place a lot of store by our values and standards, frankly, as a lot of organisations do, and it's all encapsulated in that pamphlet in the middle that you can see, Army Leadership Doctrine, which again is available as an open source document. Why? Because our youngest soldiers, who may not have come from the most privileged or advantageous backgrounds, after a very short amount of training, are likely to be sent at operations, placed in really extremely difficult situations, and forced to make life or death decisions under real pressure, and they've got to do it instinctively. And we need those decisions to be morally robust, which is why, frankly, the values and standards is the key for us to the culture, the language, and our DNA. So our basic raw definition of Army leadership is in the middle, and we split that down into three things. Firstly, character, that is about what leaders are. Exemplars rather of values and standards, they should set the example. Knowledge, this is about what leaders know. They should know their profession, they should have the skills and the capabilities required to do their job, and they know their people intimately. And then finally, action, which is about what leaders do. This relates to the Army leadership model on the right, and that is adapted, as many of you will be well aware, from Professor John Adair's action-centered leadership model, something he developed over 50 years ago whilst he was working here as an academic in the Faraday Hall at Sandhurst. It's been adapted slightly to include context, which, as you'd imagine, is in crisis and challenge, is often dynamic, uncertain, and ambiguous. And the art of leadership is to find the balance between those competing demands. The task, the mission to be achieved, the team, that they need to work together and achieve a mission, and finally, the individuals, those people who make up the team, including, in this case, the leader themselves. So the recent COVID-19 crisis is a great example to highlight some of the characteristics that we associate with crisis and challenge. As we've heard from Richard and Hugh, it was unknown and unprecedented, and there was no established framework in how to react. And as a slight aside, in my previous role, I was the Deputy Standing Joint Commander, and we had actually done a lot of wargaming for COVID. It's just that our basic assumption, which had been that we would continue to work through COVID and business would go on and that the military would underpin essential services, wasn't what happened. And then, of course, actually we stopped things and people were locked down. A crisis is unknown and unprecedented. It created uncertainty and fear within the general public. It was rapidly changing. As we've heard again, particularly from Hugh, most organisations didn't have an operational framework to respond quickly or frankly effectively to the rapidly evolving situation, and the military was not unlike Leidos in this respect, and I'm sure your IT was a lot better than ours, Hugh. We really struggled to get the connectivity to people and to be able to do those things that we needed to do. So just to give you a touch on what I'm going to come back to later, and I'd like to introduce the experience I'd like to talk about. So I was privileged in June of 2011 to take command of 104 Logistic Brigade, which is and still is the Army's strategic enabling organisation. It's about 10 regiments, regular and reserve, and it was about 5,000 people in those days. I knew I was going to deploy to Afghanistan in November 2012 to form the nucleus of what was then the Joint Force Support Headquarters in Afghanistan. A big job, frankly, commanding about 6,000 tri-service military personnel, civil servants, scientists and contractors, critically sustaining all the UK force elements, running the coupling bridge and support chains, and assisting transition to an Afghan lead. And really importantly, preparing the ground for our redeployment out of Southern Helmand in 2015, as the plan was. And the preparation saw us going through a series of conceptual and physical training exercises and team building events that sort of brought together the core of the headquarters I already had with those new individuals that would come to us and deploy with us for 6 to 9 months. Over a third of the headquarters were in continuity posts already in Afghanistan and would be in place when we arrived and relieved the bulk of the headquarters that was there. So at the time I was due to deploy with my team in late 2012, the plan was for the International Security and Assistance Force, ISAF, to transition lead security responsibility to the Afghans by the end of 2015, as it was. We were pretty comfortable at that stage that the support elements of the plan worked pretty well, but we were less sure that enough work had been done to get redeployment started, either physically or preparing the Afghans to take the lead, particularly in the areas of medical support. There was frankly a lot of PowerPoint and planning, but not a lot of activity. And as the bloke doing the photo bombing here with the Prime Minister, who was going to be holding that mop and bucket, this really worried me, and I'll return to how we address that later. I'd like to talk a little bit about the philosophy of leading in challenge, and I'll return to Adair's circles. So firstly, talking about the task, defining a purpose is obviously the responsibility of every leader, and selection and maintenance of the aim, some of you will be well aware, is the first principle of war. So in a crisis, you know that it's that focus and that aim that provides the clarity for your team and also for you as a leader. That purpose defines the why from which the what is to be achieved and derived. It critically isn't the how, that's for the team and the individuals to derive, and that's the mission command piece about giving them maximum freedom of action. That purpose builds cohesion and that unifying cause that brings the team together. It's that piece and those actions that inspire, but it can only work if you communicate, in fact, over-communicate your purpose with your team. They've got to know. You've got to encourage shared ownership, and that power of purpose is highest when it's owned, obviously, by everyone in the team. And you know, sometimes you feel overwhelmed by that. That's the moment you have to step back and remind yourself, what is the aim? Or what is it we're trying to achieve? In terms of the plan, successful navigation through any crisis or challenge is impossible without a plan. It's got to be collaborative. It's got to use the talents, experience, and the knowledge that surrounds you. And again, it's got to be communicated, because it's of little value if it's not understood. But in the midst of this, you've got to not just obviously look at the short term. You've got to look at the medium and critically the long term. That's the job of the leader. And of course, prepared to adapt, as we've heard from the other two speakers. No plan is going to survive contact with the enemy or with reality. Things are going to go wrong, and events don't turn out as you'd predicted. At that point, you've got to make decisions and prioritize the core functions of every leader. And crisis inevitably involves pressures of resources, time, information with either too much or not enough, as well as physical and psychological pressures on you and your team. It's in that sort of environment that decision-making isn't easy, and judgments are going to be impaired. And we saw that, and particularly in this you know, multi-geographical world where you're working with different people on different time zones, and how difficult it's been for people to compartmentalize and find any kind of time for themselves. So fatigue, hunger, and in some cases fear of failure are quite powerful. The environment's chaotic, confusing, and then occasionally, as we found, certainly during COVID, totally ambiguous. And I suppose just briefly, managing risk, you know, there is rarely a right call in this space. There are usually just better or worse ones. Onto the team, leaders need followers, active followers, and you've got to create an environment where people follow positively and effectively, and they've got to fully contribute to the success of the team. Team have got to understand the context, they've got to remain agile, and they've got to be adaptable to situations as they change. Again, in crisis, over communication is better than under communication, and it's got to be up, down, and across the whole organization, particularly if you're on a flat structure. Telling the truth and being honest with your people builds confidence and trust, whereas a lack of information or truth creates a void, and people fill that with often their worst fears. Challenge is important in encouraging that, and that's true particularly in organisational like ours, which is hierarchical, because it's that supports effective decision making, and that comms has got to be two-way. And learning, crisis requires us to learn quickly and innovate, and of course presents a unique opportunity for teams and organisations to adapt at pace, and we've really seen that. But it's got to be done by the leader who creates the climate where people feel empowered to do that. And sharing good practice in there. The Army's built on the team of teams philosophy, with knowledge shared as widely as it possibly can be, and that contributes to speed of change where we need to get around that loop and get that rapid flow of information to improve decision making, prioritisation, and the allocation of resources. Sorry, I'm going to go back one. And finally, the individual, looking after your people. In crisis, you need to do this more than ever. There is often a tendency to become very mission focused and focused on the tasks, but you're only going to be able to do that if you sustain each member of your team. It's really critical. And also looking after yourself as a leader. There is a real danger that we focus all our energy on those that we are responsible for, but we've got to be aware of our own physical and emotional state. Otherwise, we won't be able to make it through the challenge and the crisis. Okay, so returning to my preparation for Afghanistan. Well, to start with, it was interrupted in the Easter of 2012, and you may recall the end of March of 12, the Unite Trade Union were considering a strike over health and safety standards, which is what they said they were worried about, but it was really about pay. At that time, the memory of the 2000 fuel blockages, which was a wildcat thing, which some of you may remember, almost ground the country to a halt within about 5 to 7 days. And the government was really worried. At that stage, Unite represented about 2,000 of the tanker drivers, which was 5 of the 7 firms who delivered 90% of the Britain's forecourt requirement, which at that stage was about 120 cubic meters of fuel a day. So about 3,000, 40,000 litre tankers. At that stage, confused statements from the Prime Minister, alarmist media coverage, and promoted panic buying. And you might also recall that a woman was very seriously injured after the Minister advised us to all store petrol in our garages. So I was trying to concentrate on going to Afghanistan and preparing for that. I got a warning order on Tuesday, the 3rd of April. I went down to Army headquarters and I was told to turn up with all the people I was supposed to be taking to Afghanistan. On Monday, Thursday, the 5th of April, we arrived at Army headquarters to almost not be able to get into the building as everyone else was disappearing on leave, which wasn't great or particularly morale boosting. We then had the entire weekend to try and understand what the situation was and how we would put a plan in place to address the delivery of those 120 million cubic litres of fuel every day. The government said they had things in hand. This wasn't entirely true. They weren't prepared to prioritise fuel delivery, and they weren't prepared to enact a contingency crisis plan under what was then the Department for Energy and Climate Control and the SFS Ed Davey. So we weren't given any kind of priority, just told that we had to replicate what expert fuel drivers did on a day-to-day basis. Not, as you'd imagine, as professional logisticians, an easy thing for us to do. Anyway, we were in there for almost 3 months up until July, where we put in place a plan and a training program to train military drivers and to work with those non-striking drivers and independent contractors to be able to at least deliver 70% of forecourt requirements. It was pretty tough work and it really distracted us what we were supposed to be doing. And by the end of July, when the union voted on strike action, it was a very narrow thing with 51% voting not to strike and 49% voting to strike. So our view was, and the government's view was, that the fact that it was unlikely to be successful because the military would have at least kept things going was probably one of the primary factors in that pace. But this had taken 3 months of my preparation and training time. So there I am, turning up, going back to my headquarters near Cirencester, and then you'll recall this. We'd already seen some of the failure of the organisations that were meant to be supporting the Olympics. And on the 20th of July, G4S said that they couldn't provide the support that was required, the final piece, and we were given a warning order to set a forward operating base up in the old tobacco dock conference venue in Docklands to host 3,000 people on the 7th of July. I remember at the time tasking the commanding officer of 17 Port and Maritime to get on the road and go and recce a site for the forward operating base. He said, "Where am I going?" I said, "I don't know, mate. Get on the motorway and I hope I'll be telling you where you're going by the time you get to London." Anyway, it was a success. It wasn't easy. And we tried to make a virtue out of necessity. We turned it to our advantage. It was unexpected and unknown. It was a really great planning opportunity. There was great strategic cross-government interaction. It was good for the away team and the home team. We had great use of deputies and subordinates, and it was great to let them do their jobs. It was good for aspiration and experience, and clearly degree of supervision varies, but it was really fantastic empowerment. We came out for it stronger, but it did disrupt our preparation, and I was conscious at the time for families and loved ones. And what it essentially did was turn what was meant to be a 6 to 9 month tour into about a year-long operational tour. So I talked a little bit about selection and maintenance of the aim and understanding the problem. Well, you can't lead or give direction unless you understand the aim and what you've got to achieve. So we'd studied the role we were going to have in Afghanistan, and we thought there were 3 principal tasks. Firstly, as ever, for any support chain organization, supporting our dependency. Secondly, supporting security transition to an Afghanistan lead. And thirdly, preparing for the UK's redeployment out of southern Afghanistan. In terms of context, you may recall in September 2012, there was a ground attack by the Taliban on Camp Bastion, which sadly caused loss of life amongst the American US Marines, and the destruction of, I think, 5 or was it 7 US Harriers. I was also particularly concerned about security because we knew Prince Harry was there and would be there when we got there. Also, just to make things a little bit more spicy, at this time, most of the casualties we were receiving weren't being caused by roadside bombs or IEDs. They were actually being caused by insider attacks, where the very police and Afghan army personnel that we were training were murdering UK service personnel. The challenge, the redeployment challenge was significant. 140 bases, 11,000 20-foot ISO container equivalents, and 3,500 vehicles. So whilst we focused while our main effort was given to us as being support to the dependency, all our intellectual effort went on redeployment and Afghan medical development, on the assumption that we knew that redeployment could only come forward, particularly noting that the UK elections are going to take place in the May of 2015. So what? I've talked about the small central team we had and adding the balance in Afghanistan. So we determined that we would have to build this team together and empower it. And you've seen the forming, storming, and norming and performing piece. So it was about balancing task individual and task and team needs. It was about using judgment and taking risk. And for me, building personal credibility, both professional, personal, and technical. It was important that people knew I was straight, honest, and consistent, and a human being, and getting to know those people, because of course with the right people you can do anything, and the converse is true. This to me, and it was true during the COVID piece, was about the little things, investing in giving people your time, and the dying art of human relationships in an increasingly digital world, and really creating the environment in which they could perform. In terms of understanding the problem, yes, be bold and clear in your vision and plan and your intent, but you've got to take your people with you. They've got to buy into it, and they've got to believe in your capacity to deliver it. Particularly dealing with uncertainty, General Patton said, better a good plan now, violently executed, than a brilliant plan later, and we tended to work to that, 70–80% solutions on time, and then we moved on to the next thing. Found a lot of fear of failure, but it was really fear of letting others or themselves down. There was a bit of physical fear in this environment. I think that's been true in COVID, where there were genuinely people who had some real concerns in this area, and that will have been something that as leaders you've all had to deal with. But particularly supporting people if they get something wrong. I have a really strong view that high-performing organisations work as well when the principle isn't there as when they are, because people know what you want. You clearly articulate that intent, and they know that if they do the right thing in the absence of information, that then you'll be supporting them. So what was my problem? Well, we decided, as I said, that while supporting the the combat troops remained our main effort. It wasn't going to be our principal focus. That was going to be redeployment. Some of our problems, as some of you will be well aware, internally, the distance between Kabul and where we were in Bastion and Helmand was about 400 miles, and down to Kandahar broadly the same. It's about 3,500 miles directly back to the UK. And there was a moment when the senior logistician, who was then in the a Royal Air Force officer, who was then in the PGHQ at the time, pointed out to me that this wasn't a great deal of stuff, and you could get it all in on a one single ro-ro ferry. And I pointed out to him that that was true, and if he could find me a port in Helmand, then I would load it all up and we'd bring it back nice and easily. But until he could, we had some issues. You'll be aware that geographically and environmentally, it's a challenging place to be. We also had a number of attacks on both military and our civilian convoys, and there was real risk on interdiction in that space. And some of you, and Hugh, I'm preaching to the converted, are very well aware of this. And our main route was to bring stuff out from Afghanistan through Kandahar down to Karachi port, take it then into Minhad, and then put it onto military ro-ros and back. We also had aircraft flying back to the UK, both military and civilian, and we had a really difficult overland route that went out to the north of Afghanistan through the Slans, and then up through Russia to Riga, and then by ship in. So it was difficult. And in this, I was always mindful that getting out safely in good order was really important. It couldn't look like the American retreat from from Vietnam, with people hanging on the skids of helicopters, and that was in my mind. Secondly, CGS, at the time, Peter Wall, would repeat the quote that I gave to him, which is that 70% of the Army's future equipment capabilities behind enemy lines in Afghanistan. There was a big piece about safeguarding the taxpayers' investment, and critically, probably for the first time, really trying to show good financial propriety through the National Audit Office and having them there. So, knowing when the situation has changed, we arrived in November 2012 and took responsibility on the 1st of December. That very week, the 4-star US commander of the NATO force in Kabul issued revised orders saying that we needed to plan to have everything out of Afghanistan, not by the end of 2015, but by the end of 2014. So what we just lost a year, and not many people in the UK appeared too concerned by that. It did take a long time for people to realise the situation had changed and that we needed to act.
Shut up.
There was a lot of personal effort had to be expended in that. And I know you'll get that as people that work in the logistic world. This is about physics. And it was no longer about achieving operational effect exclusively. It was about what we could physically move in the time frame we had, because it stopped going from being a conditions-based operation to one that needed to be concluded in good order by the end of 2014. I was fortunate in this because I was well supported by the tactical commander, the other brigadier who looked after Task Force Helmand. My thoughts in this respect were in challenge: trust your instinct. If it feels right, it probably is. Listen to advice. I was getting good advice, and that helped a lot. And you're not expected to know everything as the leader, just frankly, who does know everything. In this respect, I was lucky because I had a really good bunch of active followers who really took that to heart and helped. I think there were threats and opportunities here, and certainly in business, I know risk equals opportunity and competitive advantage, and that was certainly true for us. And speaking truth into power, having the courage of convictions to know when something needs to be done. I was lucky in the first week. I had the Prime Minister, the Chief of Joint Operations, my immediate boss, the Chief of the General Staff, and actually the Princess Royal in, all of which were opportunities I shamelessly exploited to give them the pitch on what I thought needed to be done. So why was I so bothered? And some of you will have seen this before. When I arrived, and this is extrapolated through, all that we did was squeeze up everything that had to be done in the last year so that it was all done by the end of 2014. When we arrived in November of 12 and took over at the beginning of December, you'll see at the bottom, the most we'd ever moved with vehicles shown in sort of purpley colour and the gold showing material in 20-foot ISOs, was just over 200. We were planning under the current construct to be able to move 4 times as much as that in the last 2 months of activity. And that felt really risky for me. And that would have been fine if we had one of these. This would have been really helpful and we could have done it Star Trek styly. But of course, what we needed was some of that in terms of strategic lift, UK Ro-Ros, C-17s, C-17s, Antonov, and some contract 747s, military convoys, not to underestimate civilian convoys, both local and others, and delivering the task. So empowerment's about creating the conditions where people can excel, freeing up time and energy, and getting rid of needless bureaucracy. Not walking on by a problem. To me, this was indicative of part of the problem. When I got there, I said there were two things that you could see from space: the Great Wall of China and this enormous pile of shit. What people had essentially done was just pile up the rubbish in a place. And this had to be the start of getting a grip of the attitude. We deployed a team out, we got over this, and we showed what could be done with the right resources. And that's how we wanted to leave Camp Bastion and our other sites. And this was about setting the example. It was about zero tolerance and really not walking by a problem. That really helped. I had an open door policy. We didn't, I didn't have all the answers. It worked on the basis there was nobody there that was getting up in the morning saying, I'd really want to stuff up today. If there were mistakes made, they were genuine ones, but it was better to do that and get that creativity going. And that, during what was a real period of challenge for me, was hugely, hugely welcome. And again, harnessing strengths and addressing weaknesses at all levels. So how did it go? And I'm going to take this forward to sort of the end of the operation, although my time finished at the end of the middle of 2013. We deployed initially an extra 500 people. We stepped up the pace and we increased momentum. Logistics became sexy, and I know you'll all appreciate that. Frankly, I had everyone from royalty to the Prime Minister looking in boxes and talking about TEUs, and they all want to be logisticians. You know it. They all love a bit of logistics, whether they're prepared to admit it or not. We took some operational risks by cutting away key capabilities, including fast air and some of the weapon systems that people wanted to hold on to the last minute to flatten the profile. We closed the major bases of Bastion and Kandahar earlier, and we set up a review board back in the UK, which some of the people on this call were involved in, which made some really robust decisions on whether we should bring stuff back, whether we should gift it, or whether we should sell it in theatre. And in this industry was hugely beneficial to us in terms of their ideas. And certainly, firms like Agility Logistics, with Chris Murray as my sort of partner on the ground in Afghanistan, were disposing of stuff in theatre that previously would have been moved back to the UK and just thrown away. So what you'll see on those slides at the top is, it's a slightly different scales. It's a little bit confusing, is that the last year of that profile, but you'll see from that through June of 14 to what we actually achieved by November of 14, how much flatter and more sustainable that profile was. That represented a 38% reduction in redeployed vehicles and a 61% reduction in redeployed material compared to the original projection. So I suppose in summary, that was a kickstart for what became the largest logistic operation for generation. Very much a team effort. I got back from here and was sort of headhunted reasonably quickly to go and finish that job in the permanent joint headquarters as senior loggy. The Afghans were able to evacuate and treat their own casualties, and critically, logistics didn't become the story. We got out of Helmand in good order without casualties, and we closed Bastion in October and the UK equity in Kandahar in the November of 14. I'm conscious I've taken quite a lot of time. I mean, I suppose in closing, future crises and challenges are inevitable. This is not going to be the last time with COVID that we see something that disrupts us in this way. I don't think there is any magic bullet or revelation in this respect. I think it is about people. I think it's a relationship between the leader and the people and their team. I think the art, as I said at the beginning, is how you balance the task, the team and the individual against context and time. I think leaders need to prepare their people and build individual resilience and team resilience in this time. I think we need to build adaptable teams and resilient teams, and they've got to be able to act and think for themselves. I think the organizations need to build adaptable and flexible operating models so that we can respond in the future. And I suppose in closing, I suppose nurturing the right cultures now to back up the strategy gives us enduring success through challenge whenever it happens. Thank you for your patience. Lee.
Thanks, General. Hopefully people can hear me now. I mean, just before we go through the Q&A session, I just want to thank the presenters for a superb set of presentations. I think listening to that, and I recognise a lot of the theoretical or the academic, I've experienced a lot of the LIDOS support, particularly in the last sort of couple of years. And indeed, of course, I was involved in some of the activities that General Duncan has highlighted at the end. But for me, there are three key themes that come across all of those presentations this afternoon. They're about adaptability, that's organisational, individual and process. It's about the importance of communication, that's communication systems, the importance of human communication, non-verbal communication, as you pointed out, and protecting human communication systems and the priority, and about information and data, the third piece. And that's really about collation, getting better at having the right data at hand. Also, I'd say clarity, because one of the things which many of us have experienced is just because you can collect data doesn't mean you should, and doesn't mean it's any use to you. And actually there is a real challenge, I think, increasingly about clarity through complexity. What data do you want to capture and what data do you want to interrogate? And lastly, the point on Professor Richards about cyber and protecting that data. So adaptability, communication and information and data, I think the three things that came across for me across all of those three excellent presentations. And I hope that it has sparked a few questions from the audience and now I think is a good time to see what questions we've got. So I've actually got a couple of questions that I've been thinking of, but I'll go to Russ first to see whether you've got some in the queue bar that potentially we could start with. Russ, over to you.
There's only one in the questions, in the chat for the minute, and that is the art of leadership might be humility, doing something out of the goodness of your heart and not for the benefit of yourself, reciprocity, showing genuine care and respect for people, mutual exchange, give and take ideas and caring for each other's contributions, re-energizing culture, take time, create opportunity for others to experience what need to be put into practice, and how would defence adapt?
I think there's a really interesting point here, because one of the challenges that we often have when we're actually working with companies around the whole issue of leadership at Cranfield is to some degree, and it'd be interesting to get the other panel's thoughts on this, but there's a confusion between the leader and leadership, right? And so what we often find is the characteristics of leaders, but leadership, and one of the things I was just posting in the debate there is using, if you like, some of the academic definitions. We talk about direction, which is the agreement on the team about the aim, mission, vision, or the goals of the team's work, getting that direction. Alignment, which is the organization and coordination of the knowledge and the work within the team. And then the commitment element, which I mentioned, which is all those things that assist the team in gaining mutual commitment. So some of those characteristics you can see would slot into maybe creating that commitment side of things. Other things that you can see which are taking place are things that provide the direction. So the characteristics of the leader have to contribute to leadership. So I'm not sure if Major General Duncan would like to comment on that, because I think there's some really interesting nuances here which do create an awful lot of confusion, this difference between leadership and the leader. Because often we think about the lead, we have a leader, and we need to actually be able to get leadership from that leader. There's a lot of people who think that they're really good leaders, but actually they don't demonstrate any leadership, if that makes sense.
Yeah, no, thanks, Richard. I mean, it's really interesting at Zappasite because we did a big review across about 3,000 from, soldiers, frankly, from the most junior private soldier to our most senior people, about what their thoughts were about leadership and leaders in the army. And we broadly came back that what we think about leadership is good and pretty well understood. and that leadership development and leader development for our officer cohort is very good, but that leader development for our soldiers and our junior NCOs is not good, is slightly hazard, and it is not properly resourced. And of course, if we don't get that right, as we move into an area and an era when we are going to increasingly need people at the most junior leadership level to make the right decisions and be able to contribute in a team of teams, then we need to do that. So I think the question I totally recognize, and one of the areas that we've just put in a submission to the senior board at the Army for a rebalancing of resource to allow us to put a proper program that goes through with interventions, which is about coaching and mentoring and all of those kind of things that we do for officers, into our junior leaders so that they can properly understand how they lead as leaders and they show good leadership. And I think one of the things that we've learned, and if I may, one of the things that COVID has taught us, and if we're in logistics, we are both a white collar and a blue collar organization. Some of us can sit in offices behind machines, but a lot of what Hugh does relies on people making the right decisions in a blue collar area. And if we don't link that piece up, then we're putting a real risk on our organization. So I think that's probably a very long way of saying I agree, Richard.
And it fits then with this whole issue of shared leadership, because what we're having to do to share that leadership, if you like, further down the hierarchy, because you're having to get individuals to pick up that mantle of leadership. And if they don't have the correct skills, then that's where things can go wrong. So it's a really interesting debate that we're also finding very much in the commercial area as well. I mean, Hugh, I mean, what are some of your thoughts around this? Because of course it's then you've got the using the technology around that as well, haven't you?
Yeah, just building on some of those comments. It's really easy to define leadership. Any of us could define leadership. Everybody on the call define leadership in 10 words, and there'll be the real consistency. Being a leader is the difficult bit, and recognizing. I remember when I was starting out in my career, I thought leadership was being at the front. I thought leadership was being the loudest. I thought leadership was dealing with the problem and fixing the problem and demonstrating how strong and decisive I was. That didn't last very long because I wasn't very successful. Leadership, where I've learned, humility is an important word, of course, and you won't be a great leader without that. That has to be in your DNA. But actually knowing when to step back, knowing that, you talk about the sharing of leadership, Richard, and Duncan, I can only imagine what that must have been like in theatre, knowing when to step back and let someone else with the right skills in that moment to be a leader in that moment is absolutely critical. And for me, that's the class. That's where true understanding of leadership, knowing who to put up at which point is the key. And you're right about it's back to communication. It's quite easy being a leader in a changing room before you go out into the match, because you can see the whites of people's eyes. It's a bit difficult when you're relying on them to dial into a conference call or to dial into a Zoom that's not particularly effective. You're on mute. So I think the understanding the world in which the people you're leading live, and understanding that it's very, very different from your environment and your experience and your values and your view of life is equally important. Treat people how they wish to be treated, not treat people how you'd like to be treated. Thanks.
Yeah, I think if I can I think that some of the points that Richard made about the difference between a hierarchical organisation and a collaborative organisation, and certainly having spent the last sort of 6 or 7 years in the Defence Equipment Support Agency, where you find that some military personnel, for example, do not lead well in that environment, because it's a much more challenging. You've got contractors, you've got civil servants, and therefore that collaborative environment requires a different skill set from us all, rather than just the hierarchical, which some would say is actually relatively easy, because if you've got 2 pips and I've got 1 pip, I do as I'm told. But actually the world is much more nuanced than that, and the skill as a leader is looking at someone with a stripe who's the expert in bomb disposal or fuel or whatever, and then understanding, well, in that situation, that information is most important. And actually the leadership element comes from the specialist, not just from the person with the most pips who shouts the loudest. So collaborative leadership is a very different challenge, and that's something which I think we've seen over the last increasing the number of operations, Afghanistan, and into the latest pandemic, is about that collaborative leadership between the military, contractors, other government departments, etc. So it's a live issue, and I imagine that skill set will drive, and that requirement will continue to get greater as we go forward. I'm going to take the chance of jumping in with one question, then we'll go to Russ on the screen again. Really one for perhaps for Hugh, which is how do external stakeholders like yourself see the MOD now in the light of the role of the new Chief of Defence Logistics and Support, Richard Wardlaw, the Defence Support Strategy, which you referenced earlier, and the integrated review? And do you see that as an opportunity, a threat, a challenge, a risk? It's really one for you, please, to start.
All those things. I've got a SWOT analysis on the floor here, which I could, if I was brave enough, I'd read back to you. I think it's definitely an opportunity for everybody. We see opportunity for growth. We see opportunity from a commercial point of view. We see opportunity for defence in terms of reorganising themselves and reprioritising certain agenda items. I mentioned sustainability, but I also mentioned the use of data and data-driven decisions. So we see loads of opportunity. I think there are threats and weaknesses, though, around how quick we can take on the vision and mobilise that and execute that. And that means re-establishing relationships, re-establishing different forums, different communication channels, and making sure we do that at pace, and making sure that we get to a point of stability on which we're going to build. The biggest single problem I've ever experienced in my 18 months in this environment is baselining, understanding where are we now, and therefore how can we judge whether we've been successful. And if you keep changing the agenda, you never get to look back at the baseline. And for commercially, that's really difficult, right? But that's irrelevant for this conversation. That's just my problem. But actually, in terms of recognizing as a unit how we're doing in this space, has that strategy worked? You've got to understand where your starting point is before you can look back at the success of where you've got to.
Thank you. Unless Richard or General Duncan want to say anything on that one, I'll go to Russ to maybe look at the next question, please.
Okay, so next question. How important is your HR to your leadership programs in supporting individuals with personal issues to continue to thrive in a busy and demanding environment?
Shall I go first? I think HR is a function. It's there to help, it's there to guide rail. Very important function. But actually, we're talking about leadership, and anybody with a personal requirement, a personal need, should be very comfortable going to their line manager, their superior, their in command person to address it in the first instance. I see HR as a guide rail to that. In terms of the practicalities of what we experienced during COVID, we know we've had colleagues working on the end of the beds with laptops on their knees. We know that. That's poor. You don't mind doing it for a day or an afternoon, but not for a week or a month or a year. So we've supported colleagues subtly with providing equipment and resource, and also even registering them as essential workers to bring them into the office safely, to allow them to be as effective as they can be. So the HR community is incredibly important in terms of the guide rail, and actually the vision as well about what we might need in the future, what we need to anticipate to ensure our colleagues can be the best version of themselves to execute their job as effectively as they can. That would be my initial thoughts. Thank you.
Yeah, I mean, there's a really interesting debate taking place on this. I mean, one of the debates which is taking place in boardrooms at the moment is really, the first thing is infrastructure and property, okay, requirements. So we're seeing things. So, I mean, I've just got, a couple of quotes on my desktop. For example, KPMG, this was in the Times just a few days ago, are investing 44 million to implement a new working model this year, with the majority of the spend on home working technology for staff. Okay, so what you're seeing is people are saying, and that was in the article, which was talking about them closing a number of offices across the UK. Vodafone they, a few weeks ago, started talking about COVID made the old style of office obsolete. So we built a new flexible model, putting working from home on equal legal footing with the office at work. So once again, we've got this whole issue of what am I going to do with my offices? And I know I've got a friend who works in a bank. She has 180 desks in her area in this bank, in one of the big banks. She's now been told she's going to have 80 desks, and she's creating a neighborhood. That's what they're calling it. I was thinking about all the things I want in my neighborhood. I'm going to definitely have a pub, coffee house, Indian restaurants, and various other things. She says, I don't think that was on her shopping list at the time, but they're trying to create this new sort of working neighborhood. So what you can see here is we've got infrastructure and property as one thing, but if we're starting to get people working remotely, that swings then into investment in information technology. However, the big thing then is human resources. It's management in a virtual world. So we're already seeing in the press, you know, how do you make sure that people are actually working and performing? Thinking through precisely that, I've got colleagues who live in, you know, on the 7th or 8th floor of a block of flats in, you know, a one bed, you know, sort of bed. They're not in a privileged position, or like I am, or they've got young children running around as well at home and everything else. And, you know, it's all very good for me to sit in my lovely office here, which is like a little TV studio, you know, at home thinking, you know, what problems do people have? But many people actually do need to go to an office or have a place where they can work and everything else. So how do we keep people motivated? How do we keep people engaged? Because, you know, as you say, me shouting down my Zoom camera at people, you know, all they have to do is they just go, you know, camera off or mute, and you know, there goes my rant. It's not going to work, right? So we're having to think through these other things which are going on, and this is starting to put a lot of pressure on to, if you like, human resources and that management side, and that HR department is having to do some completely new things to make this work. So I think that's just, you know, my perspective, because we've got this trade-off of, you know, our property, our information systems, human resources, of course. But why is that happening? Because also the processes are starting to change as well, that we're having to work with, you know, the nature of the processes which are changing as well. So yeah, it's quite a mix, but I'll hand over to anybody else who's got comments on this one.
Gerald Duncan, just a linked question really, which is, how is the training organisation adapting to the challenges of COVID? You know, Sandhurst has a real requirement to have face-to-face interaction, on whether it's on the drill square or anywhere else. How are you coping with some of those people-related challenges?
Yeah, I mean, I couldn't have summed up the answer really to the previous question better than Hugh. You know, HR is an enabling function that supports and underpins, but looking after people is a leadership thing. And you'll have seen the chief of the general staff, is bumper sticker is people are the army, they're not in the army, and that's where we come from. And of course, I did say it earlier, you know, we are, I mean, I'm in an office, but most of our organisation is blue collar. You can't deliver logistics, you know, by moving vehicles or do engineering or fire shells or move tanks unless you're doing stuff physically. So we have to find a way to work through that. Whilst understanding that in some of the bigger headquarters, they've got the ability to be a lot more dynamic in the way they work, and I think that's important. Linking into your question about training, this year has been, I know, for a lot of organisations that are in a similar space to me, just uniquely difficult. You know, and you'll have seen your paper, we've had our own COVID outbreaks. We have had to do face-to-face training. And prior to robust testing regimes, we were having to do the isolation piece. And it's interesting, isn't it? You know, we have young people coming through here. We might talk about them in a minute, but they reflected that those that commissioned just before Easter, sorry, just after Easter in the last term, reflected that they'd had at least they'd been with their peers, they'd been achieving something they wanted to achieve, and they'd been moving forward. Whereas a lot of their friends who were either, you know, hadn't decided to go to university or post-university were either unemployed, were doing jobs, as Rich said, in their mum's house or something, or having very suboptimal university experiences. So they sort of got it, we've been very innovative and interesting. Some of those sacred cows that you might have thought at Sandhurst had to be done face to face, we've made virtual. So we've tried to be clever and we've tried to be innovative. But just, and it would be interesting, the other speakers' views, doing leadership and teaching the kind of physical leadership we want them to be able to do at the basic level for the jobs they're going to do when they first leave Sandhurst is something that does need to be done face to face. It's a physical piece, although we need to think to the future. But what we need to do in the first rung of the ladder they're on is to be able to do that piece. But this generation is very different. They want that feedback. Actually, they are, and we are as an organization now, just grappling with how we treat them. How we mold them and bring them to where we need to be, but in a way that's commensurate with the way that they want to be treated as individuals, because they have opinions, they are far more worldly wise, and they're prepared to challenge in a way that, is quite uncomfortable for some of our instructors. And we've got to reflect that. And I think, if COVID has done anything, it's allowed people that previously didn't feel they had a voice to be able to have a voice on a medium such as this. And many of the events and seminars that we've run through the Centre for Army Leadership have seen fabulous involvement and interventions for our very youngest and best leaders who felt they could do it like this, whereas they would never have stood up in an auditorium of 200 or 300 people, as we've probably got listening in today. And if we can harness that creativity, particularly in the Army, that potentially could stifle creativity because it's rank piece that Lee has talked about, will hit the sweet spot going forward. Sorry, very long answer to the question.
I think it's a really good answer. I think mainly that they're different human beings. They're different. Their world is very different from what we've seen. My son is one of the ones that's had the substandard university experience at Swansea, and he was on a Zoom call the other day, and he said, "This is a nightmare, Dad. No one's putting the cameras on." And then he did, and then other people put the cameras on. That's probably one of the proudest moments, actually, for the lazy sod that he is. But it is. One of my other sons is less extrovert, and he's found all his lessons on school in the last year. He's 15. He's developed a community of friends online. He's just started to meet them in the park. He didn't even know them before that. So they're different human beings. They have different views, and understanding the values of this virtual world and how we can build on that for leadership qualities is really, really important. Again, humility, I've seen emotional intelligence in there. True active listening skills is really important. It's difficult to listen on here, isn't it? It's more easy when you know someone's watching you. So I think all those things, we've got to not rip the book up, but we've got to add a few appendices to how we embrace technology and the experience of the last 12 months into the new leadership styles going forward.
Thank you, Hugh. Ross, next question, please.
Continuing on the theme of working at home, with more working home being proposed by more and more companies, is it not going to detract from the ability to lead and develop young leaders if they are not able to interact in person or be properly mentored?
Yes, I think it is. And therefore, I think the more value we place on that human interaction is critical. So two things: the formal interaction, so creating the environment for people to have that human contact is key for development and leadership and all that good stuff. But also the informal, the informal. Where do you really in a commercial world, where do you really do deals? Do you do them in presentations and PowerPoint and formal negotiation? No. You do them in the corridor. You do them in the pub. You do them over the water cooler. You do them where eye-to-eye trust is. We're going to dance around in front of these guys, but actually we know where we're going with this deal, don't we? Those skills are really difficult to teach, and those skills are taught. They learn them in school through contact. They learn them in sport. I'm a big believer in that, and we need to absolutely protect the ability to bring people together. It won't be as frequent. We won't take it for granted anymore, but we've got to protect it and see it for what it is, incredibly valuable. That would be my initial thought.
Yeah, and I think one of the things you're finding with the, if you like, the repurposing and review of the office, it's really to actually get that engagement. So it's about collaboration spaces, spaces where people can come together and be together rather than place where you go and you sit at your desk and all you're doing is actually calls and Zoom meetings again. You know, it's a matter of how can we create those collaborative spaces where people can come together for doing those things. And it is really critical. You know, I often talk about, you know, one of the things that, you know, university is very good at doing is giving you the IQ of supply chain and logistics. You know, that's what we teach. You know, you teach them the technical intelligence of logistics and supply chain. But the bottom line is the winner, the order winner is the EQ, the emotional intelligence, the relational intelligence. You know, what we actually say, you know, supply chain management is all about the management of relationships with all the various stakeholders to, you know, reduce costs for the supply chain as a whole and create value for the end customer. But it's about managing relationships. And that is one of those key skills that we need to actually be able to build in people, and also build resilience in that as well. You know, it's not everybody agreeing with you all the time, but it's how do you learn how to manage relationships, not just during the good times, but also the bad times in very much a physical context. That's, I think, one of the key things here. But, you know, going back to what Hugh was saying, absolutely critical. You know, how can we even use, you know, can we use the technology we have like Zoom in a less formal thing? I know I've been encouraging people. Zoom is the best platform ever for show and tell, right? Because everybody's at home and they've got their stuff. So I love doing Zoom show and tell. You know, I could do it now, but I won't because I'd bore you. But you know, I'm in my office, so it's, hey, have you seen this? You know, this comes from here. This was something which my mum gave me and everything else. So you can do some amazing show and tells. We discovered that. So there you are. There's a top tip on how to get people talking about something other than work. Show and tells.
Yeah, we've certainly found in my team again that you've got to replicate and replace that non-work engagement, because otherwise you can go through 8 to 10 hours of non-stop Skype or Zoom meetings, and you lose the ability, particularly when it comes to new joiners who've come into the team. You cannot just ignore that human factor and that human relationship. And we put in a 30-minute sort of life beyond the laptop session, and that's where people talk about their hobbies or you know their an activity they do outside of work, or they've just got a new pet, you know, and how to bring up a lizard. And the point is it means that when you are required to work, you know something about that person, and the human factors are so important. And there are some really positives aspects of the last 12 months in terms of, you know, how to work productively. For those that know Abbey Wood will know that it's always been a challenge for desks and car parking spaces. Well, not anymore, and they're taking the opportunity to change the structure so that you have collaboration zones and that you have a team working zone for those 1 day a week the team goes in to meet face to face, to have that verbal communication and that physical interaction. And then only those that need to be there for security or commercial reasons will be there on a very regular basis. And it's how industries adapt and how organisations adapt to the new ways of working and the new demands of our staff. Yeah, that's important. I've got still the opportunity to ask maybe Richard one question. What do you think the recent COVID experience has taught us about the resilience, about global supply chains? And in fact, do you think it's going to be the death of a global supply chain after the recent experience, COVID, Suez, etc.? Over to you.
Right, okay. No, we're still going to have global supply chains, but I think people are going to sort of reflect differently about how we actually manage these. So one of the key things we're finding with Industry 4.0 technology and small footprint manufacturing is that now labor costs are becoming less of a factor in terms of the total cost of that product. So therefore, you know, if you've got highly automated manufacturing processes, highly automated warehouses, and so on and so forth, what you can then do is to locate those close to your customer. So can you manufacture more locally? Now, that was a trend which has been going on for about 5 years. People were exploring this and being able to actually move things. But of course, we're going to have certain products which will be moving globally. You know, the bottom line is most of the lithium in the world, for example, comes from Australia. If you want lithium ion batteries and things like that, that's where it comes from. Cobalt comes from other locations. You know, the bottom line is, yes, we're going to have global supply chains. However, there is a trend at the moment to onshore. Can we actually review what's going on in our supply chain to actually onshore things? So this is a great opportunity. Also, can we nearshore, bring things closer to us, because that also changes the risk profile of the supply chain. But really importantly as well is the concept of multi-shoring. And the reason why, you know, I sort of think about that is that, you know, I was talking to one company recently who was very smug because they said, we've got 3 suppliers for that particular item. What they didn't realize was all those 3 suppliers were in the same country and it was locked down. And so they were just as messed up as, you know, if they'd had one supplier in that country. So can we multi-shore? So it's actually thinking around that procure for resilience rather than for cost. But it's not just about COVID which is driving this. We're also finding, you know, trade issues. So you don't have to go too far away from the UK to think about that at the moment. And some of the rhetoric we're getting from various, you know, even people across the channel in terms of what's going, it actually makes you think, well, hang on a minute, can we actually move things closer to us or get capability actually more locally to us? But also, you know, we've got global trade issues which are taking place. I mean, I was chatting to somebody recently about just vaccines, you know, the craziness of vaccines. Somebody in Hong Kong, if you want to be able to sort of travel around, you know, into Europe and the US and everything else, you need an approved vaccine. That approved vaccine is going to be the Pfizer vaccine or similar, right? However, if you want to pop across the border into China, you need to have an approved vaccine, and the approved vaccine is the Chinese vaccine. You know, they don't recognize these, the Pfizer one or the other one. So already we've got crazy situations which are developing, you know, globally in terms of just the movement of people, movement of goods, and so on and so forth. So I think we are going to see more, you know, things moving closer, thinking through you know, onshoring, nearshoring, multi-shoring, but also critically with all this, the technology rollout. So if you think about what's going on now with regards to being able to monitor and control, going back to that top of my temple of resilience, as it were, making sure you've got good information so you can spot the disruptions and then deal with that to plan with things accordingly is going to be very, very important. But an interesting debate, I think, is going to be, is just global just-in-time supply chains a thing of the past? Point for discussion. But anyway, hopefully that just gives you a few thoughts there.
That's a different seminar, Richard, isn't it?
Yeah.
Hugh, sorry, anything to add from your perspective, noting that you manage on behalf of Defence some pretty long, complicated supply chain?
Yeah, I agree. I think it's just, I think COVID's just given everyone the opportunity to rethink what they're doing. My background is retail distribution, so you know, similar scenarios and you know, the chasing the cheapest means of production or the cheapest storage costs on the other side of the world. People might be a bit more hesitant to that. Aligned to that, as Richard said, the automation and robotic, where actually the cost is less cost prohibitive to get into that space now because technology is that well developed. So a challenge on supply of labor equals investment in technology equals requirement for less labor. And actually, when you look at the COVID challenge, do you just want to bring stuff a little bit closer, a little bit under control without necessarily investing significantly more in inventory? It's all about those levers. It's that it's the graphic equalizer for me. Will the global supply chain? I thought you were going to finish that sentence, Richard, with will there continue to be a global supply chain? ... Yes, because that's my conclusion. But what it looks like, that's the debate.
Thank you. Russ, probably got time for one more. Over to you, please.
Well, there's a good one for HR, actually. As a leader in my civilian job, I have to deal with HR for my team on a daily basis. This is a new function given to all the plant leaders at my company to try and save money on HR personnel salaries. Sorry. I have no training in HR. This has taken a lot of focus off my direct process management and has caused many more issues due to leaders not knowing the process. Is this the way forward in the future, or is it a possible failure which will be pushed towards bad leadership skills?
I'll start. I probably understood half of that, but I'll answer the bit I understood. And that's not a criticism of the question, it's criticism of my ability to interpret it. I think if you've gone from a supply chain director into HR, then that's the right direction, first of all. I think you're taking into it leadership skills, and then taking the practicalities into that functional space is fantastic. And by the way, taking someone out of HR into operations is also equally valuable. And actually, that's probably where I would focus my answer to that question, that transfer of skills, seeing people's experiences from different angles is absolutely important. So you need the processes, of course you do. How you apply them, if you've got the practical experience as a supply chain director in that instance would have, then that just adds real power to the elbow, is what I would say. Thank you.
Yeah, I mean, picking up on this, that the problem is that I think we're all having to actually get involved in some HR management, whatever you want to call it. I'll put it in inverted commas, probably using the wrong terminology. The key thing is to actually recognize that we have to work within a legislative framework. There are certain things you can say, can't say, can do, can't do, you can put in adverts and everything else. Really, you need skilled HR professionals who understand that framework and everything else. However, that, I would argue, needs to be shared across the business as well. But with regard to that question, what I hope is that the company hasn't just gone and dumped, all right, we're going to fire all our HR team. They're a bunch of window dressers, and we're going to get the operations people to do HR. I hope that isn't the case, because you still need that specialism. But how it rolls out through the business, is I work with some businesses, they don't have an HR function, but what they do is they subscribe to an organization so they can get on the phone very quickly when they need to get advice about this. So, you've got to be able to get that wise, if you like, insight and skills, but sometimes you might need to phone a friend to be able to do this.
Thank you. I think we're coming towards the time. Peter, if you're there, I'm going to ask you to say any final words, or indeed I can in your place. Peter?
Well, can I just say on behalf of the listeners, how absolutely riveting and informative and enjoyable it's been listening to your observations and your advice and candor. I found it particularly interesting, as a person who's been in business for over 50 years, how interesting it is the armed forces and the commercial world are with their requirements and man management. And I suppose the lesson, if you're in the property world, they used to say location, location, location. Well, I think in the business world and the armed forces, it's people, people, people. So thank you very much indeed. We all very much enjoyed it, and particularly the efforts you put into it and your incisiveness and what you've had to say. So certainly on behalf of Carmen and the rest, my grateful thanks to you.
So thanks to all. I think on behalf of the foundation, thank you for your attendance today, and on behalf of General Fay and indeed the foundation, please keep your eyes peeled on the foundation website for the next events. They need your support, be they virtual, and hopefully the plan, of course, throughout the remainder of this year is they'll become more and more physical and more face-to-face, because I think despite the fact that we've had some great conversations about the opportunities that exist through opportunities such as Zoom, you can't beat getting in a room, and you can't be looking each other face-to-face and sharing those lessons and stories. So thank you very much on behalf of everybody that's listened, and thank you to mainly, of course, to the presenters. It's been a great experience.